It began as a quiet exchange behind closed palace doors, one so carefully concealed that even senior aides were left in the dark. But when Princess Anne and Catherine, Princess of Wales, emerged from that meeting, their expressions told a story the palace refused to. Something had shifted, something irreversible. And at the heart of it all was the Queen's private jewelry collection. What was dismissed as routine protocol would soon unravel into one of the most guarded royal secrets in decades. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What made this moment so unsettling was not just the secrecy, but the deliberate absence of the usual machinery that surrounds royal decision-making. No record keepers, no circulating briefs, no layered approvals. Just two figures, both bound by duty yet operating outside the expected framework, holding a conversation that insiders would later describe in fragments, carefully chosen words, long pauses, and a shared understanding that something fragile was at risk. Reports suggest the meeting was initiated with unusual urgency, bypassing the traditional pathways that even the most sensitive matters must follow, raising immediate concern among those familiar with the monarchy's rigid internal order. It is whispered in the highest circles that references were made to private holdings, a phrase that carries far more weight than it appears, especially when tied to the personal collection of Queen Elizabeth II, a collection that has long existed beyond public scrutiny, governed by tradition, rather than transparent decree. As those fragments of information began to circulate, another detail surfaced, one that intensified the unease. Security staff had reportedly been instructed to restrict access to specific archival vaults, areas that rarely see such sudden limitation unless something significant is unfolding. Behind the scenes, those familiar with the inner workings of Kensington Palace described a subtle but unmistakable shift in atmosphere, conversations cut short, movements more calculated, and a quiet tension settling into corridors that usually thrive on routine precision. Early whispers began to form into a narrative, suggesting that what was discussed in that room was not simply about preservation, but about protection, an active measure being drafted to safeguard something perceived as vulnerable. And as these whispers spread, so too did the realization that tensions had already been building beneath the surface, particularly around inheritance boundaries that were never formally written, yet fiercely respected. Different interpretations of past arrangements, informal understandings, and unspoken expectations had created a fragile balance, one that now seemed dangerously close to tipping. Those who had long observed the monarchy's internal dynamics began to sense that this was not an isolated conversation, but the beginning of something far more consequential, something that would challenge assumptions about control, authority, and legacy. Because when two of the most disciplined figures within the institution move in silence, it is rarely without reason, and even more rarely without consequence. But what began as a quiet meeting would soon expose a hidden vulnerability, one that threatened the very control of the monarchy's most sacred treasures. For decades, the Queen's private jewelry collection existed in a world of its own, separate from the crown jewels, untouched by public record and governed by traditions few truly understood. These were not just ornaments of power, they were symbols of continuity, passed quietly through generations. But as whispers grew louder, one unsettling question emerged: who truly controlled these treasures now that the Queen was gone? The distinction, though rarely explained to the public, has always carried immense weight within royal circles. The crown jewels belong to the institution, locked into the identity of the monarchy itself, never to be sold, never to be claimed. But the private collection of Queen Elizabeth II existed in a far more delicate space, personal, inherited, and yet deeply symbolic, blurring the line between individual possession and national legacy. It is within this blurred line that uncertainty began to take hold. Many of these pieces were not acquired through formal state channels. but arrived through deeply personal history's gifts exchanged between monarchs. Heirlooms passed through bloodlines, and carefully chosen acquisitions that reflected moments of power, diplomacy, and quiet sentiment. Each piece carried a story, but more importantly, each carried an expectation, an unspoken understanding of where it belonged and who it should ultimately serve. Yet, unlike official holdings, these expectations were rarely written down. There were no definitive public records outlining their future, no clear declarations dictating how they should be distributed after her passing. And that absence of clarity, once considered a strength of royal discretion, now revealed itself as a dangerous vulnerability. Reports suggest that within the inner circles of the monarchy, multiple interpretations of the Queen's wishes began to surface, each shaped by perspective, proximity, and perhaps even ambition. Some believed the collection should remain tightly controlled, preserved as a unified legacy under the watch of those committed to tradition. Others, however, are said to have viewed certain pieces as accessible, potentially transferable under the right circumstances, especially given the lack of formal restriction. This quiet divergence of belief did not erupt into open conflict, at least not immediately, but it created an undercurrent of tension that could no longer be ignored. Those familiar with the operations of Balmoral and Sandringham understood that these estates were more than residences. They were repositories of history, places where private holdings were safeguarded beyond the reach of public oversight. And as attention subtly shifted toward these locations, so did the concern that access to these treasures might not be as controlled as previously assumed. Senior figures within the royal family, already navigating a period of transition and uncertainty, began to recognize the stakes. Safeguarding these assets was no longer just about preservation, it was about preventing misinterpretation, misstep, or worse, quiet appropriation. Early signs of disagreement over oversight began to surface in restrained discussions, in delayed decisions, in the careful choice of words that mask deeper unease. Because when legacy is left undefined, it does not remain untouched, it invites interpretation. And within an institution built on tradition, interpretation can quickly become a battleground. And as questions about ownership intensified, so did the quiet realization that someone may have already tried to claim what was never meant to be touched. It wasn't announced. It wasn't confirmed. But insiders began to whisper of a move subtle, calculated, and dangerously close to crossing a line that had stood for generations. Access requests. Inventory reviews. Quiet inquiries into pieces long considered untouchable. What appeared procedural on the surface began to feel like something else entirely. Something deliberate. Reports suggest that within the inner administrative layers of the royal household, a series of internal requests began to surface, requests framed as routine but carrying implications that unsettled those who understood their true significance. Certain items from the late Queen Elizabeth II's private collection were reportedly flagged for review, not in a ceremonial or preservation context, but under the language of reclassification and relocation consideration. Phrases that, to seasoned custodians, signaled far more than simple paperwork. Those familiar with the archival systems whispered that the frequency of these requests was unusual, their timing even more so, arriving in close succession as though part of a coordinated effort rather than isolated administrative acts. Mentions of adjustments began appearing in internal communications, subtle shifts in wording that masked a growing intent, one that suggested certain individuals or factions believed they had the authority to reinterpret long-standing boundaries. And that belief, whether justified or not, was enough to ignite concern. Because within the monarchy, authority is rarely declared, it is understood, inherited, and guarded with precision. When that understanding begins to fracture even slightly, the consequences can ripple far beyond the immediate action. Unusual activity was reportedly logged across archival and security systems, not overt breaches, but patterns that raised questions, repeated access attempts, altered clearance levels, and documentation trails that seemed to redirect rather than clarify. For those who had spent decades protecting these assets, these were not minor irregularities, they were warning signs. A quiet unease began to settle among long-serving custodians, individuals who had witnessed transitions before but had never seen such ambiguity surrounding something so sensitive. It is whispered that conversations once held in confidence began to carry a sharper edge, with traditionalists expressing concern that informal agreements, those unwritten understandings that had preserved balance for generations, were now being interpreted as permission rather than guidance. And in that reinterpretation lay the real danger. Because when tradition is treated as suggestion rather than rule, the line between stewardship and control begins to blur. Speculation grew that an external influence, or perhaps an internal faction operating with newfound confidence, was testing the boundaries, probing how far they could go without triggering direct resistance. Yet what made this moment particularly volatile was not just the act itself, but the silence surrounding it. No immediate confrontation, no public correction, just a growing tension. A sense that something was unfolding just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment it could no longer remain hidden. And as that tension deepened, the divide between those committed to preserving tradition and those seeking to reshape it became impossible to ignore. Because within the monarchy, change is never sudden, it builds quietly, step by step, until it reaches a point where it can no longer be contained. But what those behind the scenes didn't anticipate was that two of the monarchy's most disciplined figures were already preparing to respond. Behind closed doors, far from the reach of speculation, a decision was made, one that would quietly reshape the balance of control within the royal household. Princess Anne, the unwavering guardian of tradition, and Catherine, Princess of Wales, the future queen, aligned in a way few had expected. What emerged from that meeting was not just an agreement, it was a pact. And unlike the quiet understandings that often guide royal conduct, this one carried weight, intention, and a sense of urgency that could not be ignored. Reports suggest that what they formed was a confidential framework designed not for visibility, but for protection, an invisible shield around the private holdings of Queen Elizabeth II, ensuring that no ambiguity, no reinterpretation, and no external pressure could alter what had long been preserved through discipline and restraint. Those familiar with palace administrative streams whisper that this pact was drafted with remarkable precision, bypassing conventional layers and drawing on a smaller, more trusted circle of advisors, individuals whose loyalty was not to influence but to continuity. There are suggestions that legal minds were quietly consulted beyond the usual palace channels, not to rewrite the rules, but to reinforce them, to anchor tradition in a form that could withstand even the most determined attempts to challenge it. What followed was not a dramatic announcement, but a series of controlled, deliberate adjustments that signaled something had changed. Access protocols were reportedly tightened, documentation pathways restructured, and certain classifications elevated to a level that placed them beyond routine reach. It was, by all interpretations, a strategic recalibration, one that transformed vulnerability into guarded certainty. Those who had sensed the earlier irregularities now began to understand the response, recognizing that this was not reactionary, but preemptive. Early references began to surface within internal discussions to what some described as a guiding doctrine, a quiet but firm set of principles shaping every decision that followed. It was not named publicly, but its presence was felt, influencing how authority was exercised and where it was withdrawn. Because in forming this pact, Anne and Catherine were not just protecting assets, they were redefining boundaries, subtly shifting the center of control away from broader, less predictable influences and placing it firmly in the hands of those committed to preserving the monarchy's core values. And that shift, though quiet, carried profound implications. It meant that access was no longer assumed, that interpretation would no longer override tradition, and that any attempt to blur those lines would be met not with hesitation, but with resolve. The monarchy, often seen as immovable, had adjusted quietly, decisively, and with a clarity that left little room for doubt. And as this new framework settled into place, the atmosphere within the palace began to change once again. This time, not with uncertainty, but with the unmistakable sense that control had been reclaimed. And once the pact was in motion, the consequences began to ripple through the palace in ways no one could ignore. There were no public statements, no official announcements, but inside the palace, the atmosphere changed overnight. Access was restricted. Names quietly removed from internal lists. Conversations cut short. What had once been open corridors of influence became tightly controlled pathways. Something had been locked down, and not everyone was pleased. Reports suggest that within hours of the pact taking hold, subtle yet unmistakable adjustments began to surface across departments tied to royal assets, particularly those connected to the private holdings of Queen Elizabeth II. Entry permissions that had remained unchanged for years were quietly revised, with certain individuals finding their access reduced or entirely withdrawn without formal explanation. Those familiar with the system understood immediately this was not routine maintenance. This was deliberate containment. Administrative reshuffling followed, not in sweeping, visible motions, but in precise, almost surgical placements. Roles were redefined, responsibilities reassigned, and oversight channels narrowed, creating a structure where fewer voices held greater control. For some, this shift was interpreted as necessary discipline, a long overdue tightening of boundaries. For others, it felt like exclusion, an abrupt and unsettling removal from spaces they had once navigated freely. Frustration began to simmer beneath the surface, particularly among those who had previously held influence over these collections. Individuals who now found themselves distanced from decisions they once helped shape. It is whispered that meetings grew shorter, discussions more guarded, and the tone within internal exchanges noticeably colder. Because when access is reduced without confrontation, it sends a message far more powerful than words ever could. Certain figures, once central to these conversations, were gradually eased away from key decision-making roles, their absence explained through procedural language that masked the underlying intent. This quiet distancing did not erupt into open conflict, but it created a tension that was impossible to ignore, a recognition that the balance had shifted, and not in their favor. At the center of this evolving dynamic stood King Charles III, reportedly aware of the developments yet choosing not to intervene directly. Different interpretations of his position suggest a deliberate restraint, a decision to allow the situation to stabilize under the guidance of those enforcing the new framework rather than risk further escalation. Because stepping in too soon or too forcefully could have fractured the fragile control that had just been re-established. And so, the silence from the top became its own form of approval, reinforcing the authority of those now shaping the outcome. Speculation grew that this entire sequence of actions was not simply reactive, but preventative, designed to halt any further attempts to test the boundaries before they could gain momentum. And as these changes settled into place, something else began to emerge: an undeniable shift in internal alliances. Loyalty lines, once blurred by shared responsibility, became clearer, more defined. Individuals aligned themselves not just with roles, but with principles: preservation or reinterpretation, tradition or adaptation. Because in moments like this, neutrality rarely survives. The palace, long sustained by its careful balance of power, had entered a new phase one, where control was no longer assumed, but actively enforced. And beneath the controlled surface, the realization spread that this was more than a temporary adjustment, it was a redefinition. But beyond the immediate fallout, a deeper message was being sent, one that redefined the rules of power within the monarchy itself. What unfolded next was not just a response, it was a declaration. A quiet but unmistakable reminder that some things within the monarchy are not negotiable, not transferable, not open to interpretation. As the dust settled, one truth became clear: the Queen's private legacy would not be rewritten. In the days that followed, the shift that had begun in silence took on a firmer, almost immovable presence, as though the institution itself had drawn a line and stepped behind it with unwavering resolve. Reports suggest that long-standing protocols, those often left unspoken, yet deeply embedded in the monarchy's structure, were not rewritten, but reaffirmed, brought forward with a clarity that left little room for ambiguity. These were not new rules. They were old ones, revived with purpose, reminding everyone within the royal orbit that inheritance, especially of something so personal yet symbolically powerful, is never a matter of convenience or timing, it is a matter of duty. Those familiar with the inner workings of the royal household began to sense the emergence of a unified front, one that extended beyond individual roles and into a collective understanding. Figures who had long operated independently now appeared aligned, not through public display, but through consistent, coordinated restraint. It was as if an unspoken agreement had been reached that protecting the private holdings of Queen Elizabeth II was no longer a matter of preference, but of obligation. And in that alignment, the monarchy found stability where there had once been uncertainty. What made this moment particularly significant was its symbolic weight. Control was not seized in a dramatic gesture, but reasserted through discipline, through the quiet enforcement of boundaries that had always existed but were now impossible to overlook. Access remained limited. Oversight remained focused, and the message became increasingly clear: these assets were not to be approached as opportunities, but as responsibilities. Interpretations of the pact formed between Princess Anne and Catherine, Princess of Wales, began to evolve within palace discussions, shifting from initial speculation to a broader understanding that their actions were not aggressive, but protective. This was not a move against individuals, but a move for preservation, a deliberate effort to prevent further strain on an already delicate transition. And as that understanding settled, so too did the tension that had quietly built over previous weeks. Conversations became less guarded, movements more measured. The sharp edge of uncertainty began to soften, replaced by a steadier rhythm that suggested control had not only been regained, but strengthened. More importantly, a deeper principle began to take hold, one that transcended the immediate situation. Duty over personal interest. Preservation over interpretation. These were not new ideas, but they were being felt with renewed intensity, shaping decisions in ways that extended beyond the jewelry itself. Because within the monarchy, every action carries meaning, and every decision echoes into the future. The broader message sent across the institution was impossible to ignore. Legacy is not something to be adjusted in moments of uncertainty, it is something to be defended, even when doing so requires difficult, quiet decisions. And in choosing that path, the monarchy did not just protect its past, it secured its direction forward, reinforcing the idea that some elements of its identity remain untouchable, no matter the circumstances. And in the silence that followed, the monarchy stood not divided, but reinforced, bound tighter by duty than ever before. No official warning was issued, no names were called, but within the palace walls, the message was understood with chilling clarity. Lines had been drawn quietly, firmly, permanently, and those who had come close to crossing them now faced a reality they hadn't anticipated. What followed was not confrontation, but something far more effective: precision signaling, delivered through silence, structure, and unmistakable restraint. Reports suggest that across the royal household, subtle cues began to circulate, not in words, but in actions that spoke louder than any declaration ever could. Invitations adjusted. Access quietly refined. Channels of influence narrowed with deliberate care. Those familiar with the institution recognized it immediately. This was how the monarchy communicates when it chooses not to speak. And the message carried weight. Boundaries had been reinforced, and any attempt to test them again would not be overlooked. Within this recalibrated environment, hierarchy was no longer implied. It was reinforced, almost methodically, as though the very structure of authority had been polished back into its original form. Long-standing roles regained their clarity, while emerging figures were placed with intention, creating a balance that favored stability over expansion. At the center of this shift stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role, once viewed through the lens of future expectation, had now transformed into something far more immediate and consequential. No longer just a figure of continuity, she had become an active protector of institutional integrity, someone willing to step into the space where preservation meets action. Alongside her, Princess Anne's presence only grew stronger, her reputation as the monarchy's most disciplined guardian reinforced with each quiet decision, each calculated move that prioritized tradition over convenience. Together, they represented not a shift in power, but a reaffirmation of it, anchoring the monarchy to its core principles at a moment when uncertainty could have easily reshaped them. The implications of these developments stretched far beyond the immediate situation. Those who once believed influence over royal assets could be expanded or reinterpreted began to understand the limits that had now been firmly re-established. Because within the monarchy, influence is not simply about proximity, it is about trust. And trust, once questioned, is not easily restored. A growing awareness settled among all factions that future attempts to navigate these boundaries would be met not with negotiation, but with resistance, quiet, controlled, and unwavering. This realization did not erupt into visible conflict, but it altered behavior in ways that were impossible to ignore. Conversations became more measured, decisions more cautious. The internal dynamics, once fluid, began to solidify into something far more defined. It was not a return to the past, but a strategic recalibration, an adjustment that ensured the institution could move forward without losing the essence that had sustained it for generations. Because in moments like this, the monarchy does not simply react, it reasserts itself, reminding all who operate within its sphere that its foundations are not easily shaken. And as this new balance took hold, the true weight of what had transpired became clear not as a singular event, but as a turning point that would shape how authority, legacy, and responsibility are understood moving forward. Because this was never just about jewelry, it was about control, legacy, and the future of the crown itself. In the end, nothing was announced, but everything had changed. The Queen's private collection remained untouched, its future no longer uncertain. And behind that quiet resolution stood two figures who had acted not for power, but for preservation. In a moment that could have fractured the institution, they chose to fortify it instead. What makes this conclusion so striking is not what was said, but what was deliberately left unsaid. There were no press briefings, no carefully worded statements, no orchestrated reassurances to the public. And yet, within the inner workings of the monarchy, the outcome was unmistakable. Stability had returned not through force, but through control. The uncertainty that once hovered over the private holdings of Queen Elizabeth II had been quietly resolved, not by rewriting history, but by protecting it from reinterpretation. Reports suggest that the situation reached a point of final stabilization without triggering any external controversy, a rare achievement in a moment that carried such potential for exposure. Those who had watched the tension build now observed something very different, a calm that did not feel accidental, but earned, shaped by deliberate action and unwavering discipline. The monarchy, often tested during moments of transition, had once again leaned into its oldest strength: continuity. And within that continuity, a renewed commitment to tradition began to take form, not as a rigid constraint, but as a guiding force that ensured the institution could endure without losing its identity. At the center of this transformation stood Catherine, Princess of Wales, whose role had evolved in a way that few could have predicted. What was once seen as preparation for the future had become active participation in the present, marking this moment as a defining chapter in her journey within the monarchy. Alongside her, Princess Anne's legacy was further cemented, her reputation as a protector of royal tradition no longer just acknowledged, but reinforced through action. Together, they had done more than respond to a challenge, they had reshaped how such challenges would be handled moving forward. Because beyond the immediate resolution, something more enduring had been established. Long-term safeguarding mechanisms, though never publicly detailed, were now understood to be firmly in place, ensuring that the vulnerabilities once exposed would not resurface in the same way again. The Queen's private jewelry, once the center of quiet tension, had been reframed as something far greater than individual possession. It had become a symbol of enduring legacy. A reminder that within the monarchy, certain elements transcend ownership and enter the realm of responsibility. And as this understanding settled into the fabric of the institution, it carried with it a deeper reflection on what had truly been at stake. This was never just about access or control. It was about duty, about sacrifice, about the willingness to act decisively in order to preserve something that cannot be easily replaced. The monarchy had faced a moment that could have altered its internal balance, and instead, it had emerged more defined, more disciplined, and more aware of the fragile line between continuity and change. And in that awareness, it found strength not in resistance, but in clarity. Because survival, in this context, is not about avoiding conflict. It is about navigating it with purpose, ensuring that the institution remains intact for those who will inherit it next. And as that chapter quietly closed, the silence that followed was not empty, it was filled with the weight of decisions made, boundaries restored, and a legacy secured not through declaration, but through unwavering resolve. And as history moves forward, one truth will remain within the monarchy: legacy is never given, it is fiercely protected. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.